Over the last few years, I have made some awesome upgrades to my gaming PC. And it all started with an upgrade from an i7 8700K to the i9 9900K. So I went from 6 cores and 12 threads all the way up to 8 cores and 16 threads, overclocked on all cores to 5 gigahertz. And that was kind of the peak of performance a few years ago from Intel. And it also allowed me to maintain the same motherboard setup. So Z390 supported both 8th and 9th gen Intel, which has kind of been why I haven't upgraded the CPU since. I wanted to stick with that same motherboard. It's a pretty costly investment upgrading a CPU when it goes to that generation when everything kind of changes up and a new motherboard is required. But this thing has lasted me so well over the last few years, allowing me to upgrade my graphics card from a 1660 Super to a 2070 Super, up to a 3080 Ti, and now with the Galax RTX 4080. Overall, it has been amazing and allowed me to get kind of peak FPS numbers out of these cards over the last few years. But of course, now with the RTX 4080, this thing is so fast and so powerful that the 9900K is starting to show its age in a few games. And recently I built a PC with the i5 12600K, which was an awesome eye-opening experience because I just saw how much more powerful an i5 12600K is compared to the i9 9900K. So you may think going from an i9 to an i5 is a downgrade, but in a lot of situations with these older generation i9s or even i7s, going to an i5 is honestly an upgrade for a lot of users. So yeah, I've kind of been putting off this upgrade. I didn't really want to have to go through the whole process of swapping out my motherboard, swapping out an SSD once PCIe Gen 4 capabilities came in, which was after Z390. Also with DDR5 coming onto the map with memory, overall there's a lot of opportunities to get much more performance out of this system. Upgrading to a newer generation CPU, I've just kind of put it off over the last couple of years just because it's a lot of work, at least in my mind, to have to swap out all of those components. But I finally decided it is time to get the peak performance out of this RTX 4080 with some ambitions to go probably 4K when it comes to a gaming monitor. And once that happens, I need my CPU to be able to manage the same amount of performance that the 4080 is capable of. So let's first just take a look at some benchmarks with the existing hardware to see what the system is capable of before any upgrades take place to our CPU. So the first game we're going to take a look at is Valorant, a really good measure in terms of high FPS gaming where the CPU is really going to be the bottleneck. Similar here with Call of Duty, we're playing on balanced settings. The CPU, as we'll see in a minute, is still kind of 50-50 bottlenecking the system along with our GPU. And finally, we're going to take a look at F1, more of a ray tracing intensive, more visually focused, resolution focused game. And with all three of these games, we're seeing really, really good FPS even with this older CPU. So 310 FPS on average in Valorant, 201 in COD, MW2, and 216 in Formula 1 2022. So overall performance is still looking really, really good at 1440p and high refresh rate for a lot of the games I just showed. But there's definitely some opportunity for improvement where we are seeing in kind of the really high refresh rate games like Valorant, where maybe we're not actually outputting 300 or 400 FPS on our monitor. The CPU is definitely the bottleneck in those situations. And as we turn down the graphic settings in games like Modern Warfare, where we're trying to push FPS numbers, again, we see the bottleneck being the CPU. So yes, it is time for an upgrade, and we're upgrading with what is behind me, which is a Z690 motherboard. So it is a last generation motherboard, kind of like a 12th gen kickoff with an i7 13700K, 32 gigabytes of DDR5, 6000 megahertz memory, and then a PCIe Gen 4 SSD. Overall, this is going to be a major overhaul to this system. We're going to have to reinstall Windows onto that new drive, kind of reset up this PC from scratch, but I think it's going to be worth it once we get to see the performance on the other side. So let's get started. Let's start swapping out components. Hopefully this is a pretty simple process, but I'll walk you guys through it, and then we'll see on the other side what the performance looks like with the newest generation i7 13700K and our RTX 4080. So let's jump into the upgrade. First things first, we have to, of course, unplug everything out of our existing Z390 motherboard. That means that the cooler's got to be taken off, all of the power plugs, all of the USB plugs, USB 3, USB 2, your front panel connectors, audio, fans, everything's got to go and make room for our new motherboard. And here it is, the Z690 Prime A motherboard, a great board with a lot of features. The one thing we did have to do in order to continue to use our Elite H150i Capellix Corsair cooler is get the LGA 1700 mounting brackets in order to have the correct standoff height for the new CPU. We get 4 M.2 slots on this board. We get 6 USB Type A, 2 Type C, and 2.5 gig Ethernet. No Wi-Fi, but that is fine for this particular build. And here we go, the i7-13700K, definitely a little bit bigger than that Z690 or the Z390 with the 9900K being an LGA 1151 socket. So yeah, a bigger chip, and that will mean more power, which we will see in a little bit. But we'll get this thing installed. Very simple, of course. You got the retention arm, you just got to drop that thing down, and your CPU is in place. Overall, of course, building on a new motherboard is extremely simple, whether you're doing a new build or upgrading a build with a new motherboard. Overall, a lot of these processes are pretty easy. Your CPU, your RAM install, your SSD install, relatively simple steps when it comes to the building process. Maybe can be a little bit nerve-wracking, especially with all those pins in that LGA 1700 socket, but it's not too bad. And then here comes the tedious part, which is now plugging everything back into our new motherboard. And I did have to route a second CPU 8-pin connector due to this motherboard now having 2 8-pin CPU power connectors, where the old Z390 one only had 1. We got our thermal paste in, our CPU cooler back installed, all of our plugs connected, and our GPU reinstalled. And this thing is as good as new. And you may be asking the question, why a last gen motherboard with the newest generation 13th gen CPU? And the answer to that question is a Micro Center bundle deal, which allowed me to get both the RAM, motherboard, and CPU for all in at $600. Now, that is a great deal considering that the motherboard alone is around $250 to $300, the CPU is another $300 to $400, and then you're also looking at another $150 for memory. So all in all, a $600 bundle with Micro Center, even going last gen on the motherboard. I was like, that is perfectly fine. We'll go with the last gen motherboard to get current gen CPU performance. So of course, we're gonna test with the exact same suite of games and make sure to pay attention to the FPS numbers that you're seeing in these titles. So Valorant, Call of Duty MW2, and F1, a really good suite of games. And we'll see in the numbers for Call of Duty, very similar, if not almost the same within margin of error, but we can see how much the GPU versus CPU bottleneck has switched to being GPU bottlenecked. F1, of course, looks as beautiful as ever, and here are the numbers compared to last time. So we get a 62% bump in Valorant. Not that you're ever outputting 502 FPS to a monitor, but now you can take full advantage of, let's say, a 360 hertz monitor. We do have pretty much within margin of error for COD MW2, so no real changes there, but we are GPU bottlenecked for sure. We went from like 50% GPU to now 99% GPU bottlenecked. And then when it comes to F1 2022, we're looking at a 32% increase to 285 FPS. Overall, these are amazing bumps in the majority of the titles. Of course, COD MW2 being the only kind of standout, not getting a big jump. But overall, super impressed by the bump in performance with the 13700K, and also just the overall performance increase that I'm getting with Z690 when it comes to memory, when it comes to SSD speed. Overall, extremely happy with this build. If you guys have any questions or comments, definitely leave those down below. If you haven't already, get subscribed to the channel, and I will see you guys in the next one.